On a bitterly cold winter night, a man stood in the shadows outside an abandoned warehouse, heart pounding, breath fogging in the freezing air. His name was James Walker, a quiet, solitary figure, known to few and understood by even fewer. What he was about to do would brand him a criminal in the eyes of the law, but to him, it wasn't theft. It was survival. It was love. It was the last desperate act of a man who had nothing left to lose. The cold night air cut through James Walker's clothes as he moved through the dark streets, every step dragging him further into the web of his own decisions. The city was eerily quiet, its usual hum of life silenced by the late hour. The harsh glow of street lamps illuminated his path, casting long, ghostly shadows on the cracked pavement, which seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. His breath, shallow and quick, turned into wisps of vapor that dissipated into the cold night air, but inside, his pulse was erratic, his heart racing with a mix of fear and guilt. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to be standing on the edge of everything he had tried so desperately to outrun. But tonight, he had no choice. The promise he had made years ago still haunted him like a shadow, and it was this shadow that had led him here, to this forsaken warehouse, under the cover of darkness. The past few years had been a blur of mistakes, bad choices, and regrets, but this was the breaking point. James' hand trembled as he reached for the rusted door handle of the warehouse. His fingers, cold and stiff, brushed the metal, and for a split second, he thought about turning back. He could leave now, walk away, and try to put this all behind him. But he couldn't. He had made a promise to someone long ago, a promise that no matter what, he would protect them. And now, all he had left of that promise was this. With a sharp inhale, he pushed open the door. The groan of the metal echoed in the emptiness of the room, a stark contrast to the stillness outside. The warehouse was dark, the only sounds the faint squeaks of his boots against the concrete floor as he moved deeper into the shadows. His eyes darted around the room, searching, but he knew exactly where to go. He had been here before, many times, in fact, but this time felt different. This time, there was no turning back. As he approached the corner of the room, his gaze fell upon the crate that held the remnants of his past, the final piece of a broken promise. The wooden crate sat there, untouched and forgotten by everyone except him. He hesitated for a moment, standing there in the quiet, his chest tight with anticipation. His fingers brushed against the old wood, and a wave of guilt washed over him. This wasn't supposed to be the way things ended. He had wanted more. He had wanted redemption. With a quick movement, he pried open the lid, revealing a stack of old, brittle letters, faded photographs, and a small, delicate box wrapped in fraying ribbon. The sight of it made his chest tighten. This was it, the object that held the last shred of what he had once believed in. He had come for this, the tangible remnants of a time he could never get back. He reached for the box, his hands shaking as he pulled it from the crate. It was heavy, not in weight, but in meaning. His mind flashed to the past, his childhood, the days when life had felt simple, when he had felt safe. But that was before everything changed, before he made choices that would forever alter the course of his life. He could feel the weight of those decisions pressing down on him now. The years of running, hiding, lying, they had led him here, to this final moment. His grip on the box tightened as his thoughts became a whirlwind of regret. His breath came faster now, his chest rising and falling in frantic bursts. The sound of sirens suddenly pierced the quiet of the night, sending a jolt of panic through him. The sound was distant at first, but it was growing closer, a reminder that time was running out. He had been spotted. Freeze! The sharp command rang out from behind him, and James froze. His heart pounded in his ears as he slowly turned, his eyes locking onto the two officers who had entered the warehouse. His gaze was hard, his body tense, but inside, he felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss below. This was it. This was the moment where everything would either be lost or salvaged. The officers' expressions were confused, unsure of what they were facing. James stood still, his hands still clutching the box. There was no denying it anymore. He had made his choices, and now, he would face the consequences. But in this moment, something inside him refused to back down. "I didn't come here to steal," James said, his voice low and steady, though his insides felt like they were unraveling. "I came here to remember. To protect what's left." His eyes held their gaze, defiant yet broken. The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure of what to make of his words. But for James, it didn't matter anymore. He had already lost so much that could never be fixed, and now, he was standing here, holding the last piece of what he had once promised to protect. He took a deep breath, knowing that whatever happened next, he had fulfilled his duty. The sirens wailed louder now, but in that moment, he found a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of victory, nor was it the peace of redemption. It was the peace of acceptance, the acceptance that he had done everything he could, and that, perhaps, was enough. James stood in the dimly lit warehouse, the shadows of the towering crates and broken windows stretching across the room like silent witnesses to his internal battle. His hands were trembling, but it wasn't from the cold or fear. It was from the weight of the decision he had just made. The small, seemingly insignificant box in his hands felt heavier than the burden of his entire past. His fingers were white-knuckled around it, as though he was clinging to the last shred of control he had in this fractured moment of his life. The distant sound of sirens wailing in the background seemed to mirror the chaos in his mind. The officers had surrounded him now, blocking any potential escape, their eyes fixed on him with suspicion and a hint of caution. James could hear the soft shuffle of their boots on the concrete floor, but it felt like everything was moving in slow motion, like he was trapped in some suspended moment, caught between what he had done and what he was about to face. The younger officer, his face young but hardened by the world around him, spoke first. His voice was shaky, betraying his nerves despite the authoritative stance he tried to maintain. "Sir, what's in the box?" He took a step forward, his hand hovering over his holster. It was clear he wasn't sure whether to approach cautiously or take the offensive. There was a hesitation in his tone, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but that uncertainty only seemed to make James feel more cornered. Like an animal caught in a trap. James' throat tightened as he swallowed, but the words that came out were strangely calm, too calm. "It's not what you think." His voice was quiet, but steady. It was a lie, of course. But it was the only way he knew how to protect what little was left of him. "It's just a part of my past." He shook his head, almost disbelieving the words that had left his mouth. How could something so small, so simple, carry the weight of everything he had buried? The older officer, his face weathered by years of experience, stepped forward next. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though he was calculating every word, every action. "You need to drop the box, James," the officer said, his tone firm but not harsh. There was a shift in the air, a palpable tension, as though the officer was trying to appeal to something in James that was still human, still reachable. "This won't end well if you don't." The words were not a threat, they were a plea, even if unspoken. James' heart hammered in his chest, his mind racing with the weight of the officer's words. He didn't want to look at the box. He didn't want to think about what it represented. The memories it carried were like ghosts, haunting him at every turn. He had spent years trying to bury them, to bury the man he used to be, the mistakes that had followed him like shadows. But the box, The box was a reminder that no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he tried to escape, the past always found a way to catch up. For a brief, agonizing moment, he thought about throwing the box aside and bolting, disappearing into the night. It wouldn't be the first time he had run. But something inside him, the part that had long been buried under layers of guilt and regret, made him hesitate. He didn't want to run anymore. The thought made him sick. The shame, the lies, the constant fear, it had all led him here. With a shaky breath, James slowly lowered the box to the ground, his fingers lingering on the worn surface as if he were reluctant to let go of the last piece of his old self. The officers stood motionless, watching him, but James could feel their eyes on him like heat, like judgment. He felt the weight of their stares digging into his skin, the coldness of their unspoken questions. "Please," James whispered, almost pleading with himself. "I'm not the man I was." The words were a desperate confession, a fragile attempt at redemption, but he knew they wouldn't be enough. Nothing could undo what had been done. He could feel the years of mistakes closing in on him, suffocating him with their inevitability. But as the words left his mouth, a strange sense of clarity washed over him, something he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't running. Not anymore. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably on his feet, glancing at his partner, who remained stoic. The older officer, his eyes never leaving James, took a step forward, his voice softened by a mix of pity and resolve. "James, this isn't you. Whatever it is, whatever you're hiding, we can help you. But you have to let us." James looked up at the officer, his chest tightening as a flood of emotions surged through him. He could hear the officer's words, but they felt so distant, so foreign. Help? Could anyone really help him now? The mistakes he had made were irreversible, and no amount of words could change that. He wanted to believe in the offer of help, but he was too far gone, too lost in his own guilt to grasp at it. The warehouse felt smaller now, the walls closing in, as James fought to keep himself composed. His hands shook more violently now, and for a moment, he feared he might lose his grip on the last shred of control he had over himself. But he couldn't let go. Not now. Not when the consequences were right in front of him. I don't want to do this," he murmured, the words thick with regret, the weight of them sinking deep into his soul. "But I don't know how to stop." The officers exchanged looks, but there was nothing they could do. This was James' choice to make now. And as much as they might want to save him from the destruction he had set in motion, they couldn't. Not anymore. With a final, steadying breath, James turned away, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon beyond the warehouse. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. But he knew, deep down, that the road ahead would be long, and there would be no escaping the reckoning that was coming for him. He wasn't just facing the law anymore. He was facing himself. The silence in the warehouse felt suffocating, like a heavy cloak draped over everything, suffusing the air with an unbearable tension. James stood there, frozen in place, his eyes scanning the room. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of police radios and the soft shuffle of boots on the concrete floor. His body was still, but his mind was a whirlwind, spinning with fear, regret, and disbelief. How had he gotten here? How had his life come to this? The officers didn't move, didn't speak. They were waiting, their eyes fixed on him, their stance professional but tinged with the quiet anticipation of something big about to unfold. Every second felt like an eternity. James could feel the weight of their gazes, pressing down on him, dissecting him. But more than that, he could feel the weight of his own past, lurking just behind him, threatening to swallow him whole. The box, the one thing that had brought him to this precipice, sat on the ground beside him. He hadn't moved it since he'd placed it there. Its presence was like an anchor, a reminder of all that had been lost, all that had gone wrong. James' fingers twitched involuntarily, his heart beating erratically as he stood there, unable to look away from the box. The memories that came with it were both a burden and a curse, memories of betrayal, choices made in the shadows, and a life that seemed to be spiraling out of control. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he was paralyzed. His eyes darted back to the officers, their faces unreadable. He had known this day would come, but he had never imagined it would feel like this. The anticipation was like a tight knot in his chest, threatening to choke him. He wanted to speak, wanted to explain, to justify, but the words were stuck, trapped in his throat. Everything he had done, everything he had tried to avoid, was right here in this moment. There was no more running, no more hiding. The past had caught up with him, and it was demanding its due. James' gaze shifted down to the box once more, his hands trembling as they hovered over it. The edges of the box felt smooth under his fingertips, yet there was a sharpness to it, as if it were alive, as if it were daring him to face what was inside. His stomach churned at the thought of what was in there, at the choices that had led to this point. The people he had betrayed. The secrets he had kept. The lies that had slowly eaten away at his conscience. He could almost hear their voices now, echoing in his mind, distant but undeniable, full of accusation and sorrow. He thought about the years he had spent running from the truth, from the consequences of his actions. Each decision, each step had taken him further away from who he once was, further away from redemption, from peace. But here, in this dark, cold warehouse, he could no longer escape the reality of what he had done. With a deep breath, James bent down slowly, his body stiff, as though moving through quicksand. The box was heavier than he remembered, and for a fleeting second, he thought he might drop it. But he held on, gripping it with both hands, his fingers digging into the cardboard. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood back up, the box now cradled in his arms like a fragile, fragile promise. A promise of what? Of redemption? Of absolution? He wasn't sure anymore. He wasn't sure of anything. His eyes met the older officer's, the one who had been watching him closely, almost as if he were waiting for something, waiting for James to make the first move. The officer's expression was calm, almost compassionate, but there was a steely determination in his gaze. James could feel it, that unwavering focus, like the officer could see straight through him. And for a moment, James wondered if that was what he needed. Someone who could see past the lies, the guilt, the fear. "I'm not the man I used to be," James muttered, the words escaping his lips before he could stop them. The admission felt strange, bitter in his mouth, but it was the truth. He had changed. He had fallen, and now, in this moment, he had to decide if he would rise again. He wasn't sure if he was capable of that, but he knew one thing: he couldn't keep running. Not anymore. The officer nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. But his voice, when it came, was calm, measured. "I believe you, James. But you can't undo what's been done. You can only choose what you do next. Right now, it's about who you're willing to be. Not who you were." James' breath hitched. The officer's words struck deep, resonating in a way James hadn't expected. His chest tightened as the weight of the decision settled over him. Could he do this? Could he really face the consequences of his actions? Was he strong enough to stand up, to take responsibility, to let go of the past and move forward? With trembling hands, James lifted the box and held it out to the officer. The older man didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He took the box carefully, his fingers brushing against James' palms. There was something there, an understanding, a connection, that passed between them, and for a moment, James felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. Maybe, just maybe, he could start again. Maybe the past didn't have to define him forever. As the officer held the box, his gaze locked onto James. "This is it. There's no going back from here." James nodded, his throat tight, his emotions swirling in a torrent he couldn't control. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a small sense of peace. The truth was out. The weight that had pressed down on him for so long was finally being lifted, piece by piece. It wasn't over. It was only beginning. But at least now, he could move forward. And maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to live with himself again. The warehouse was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made every movement feel heavy. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sterile glow across the empty space. James stood frozen, his hands still trembling, watching as the officer took the box from him. It wasn't just any box. It was the last thread of hope he had left, the final piece of a puzzle that, once solved, could change everything or destroy him completely. His fingers brushed against the cardboard surface, and for a moment, he thought he might pull it back. But he didn't. The decision had already been made, and there was no turning back now. His stomach twisted as the officer carefully examined the box, glancing up only briefly to meet his eyes. James could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, each beat a reminder of how much was at stake. He had given up everything to get here, his pride, his dignity, his sense of control. And now, standing in this cold, silent room, all he could think about was whether he had made the right choice. Was he doing the right thing? Or had he just sealed his own fate? The officer's voice cut through his thoughts, calm and measured. "You understand what this means, don't you?" James nodded, though his throat felt tight, and his mouth went dry. "I do," he muttered, though the words felt hollow, as if they didn't belong to him. They were the words he thought he should say, the words that everyone expected to hear. But the truth was, James didn't know if he understood at all. His mind was spinning, caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of him felt a strange sense of relief, like the weight he had been carrying for so long was finally being lifted, even though he knew that lifting it meant revealing everything he had kept hidden for years. It was terrifying. The other part of him felt betrayed, by himself, by the system, by everything he had believed in. He had spent so long running from the past, trying to bury the truth under layers of lies and half-truths. And now, in this moment, that truth was about to come rushing back at him with all the force of a tidal wave. "I've been sure for a long time," he finally said, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. His hands clenched at his sides, the trembling almost uncontrollable now. He didn't want to show weakness. Not here, not now. But the fear was still there, gnawing at him, clawing at his insides. The fear of what would happen when this was all over. The fear that he had made a mistake. The officer took a slow step closer, his presence steady, unyielding. "You don't have to go through with this, James. You don't have to hand everything over." His voice softened, like he was trying to reach something inside of him that James himself couldn't see. "We can help you. You don't have to carry this burden alone." The words were meant to comfort, but they only made James feel more isolated. Help? How could anyone help him now? He had made his bed. The past had its claws so deeply embedded in him that there was no escaping it. The officer didn't understand. No one did. "I've already come this far," James said, forcing himself to meet the officer's gaze, his eyes burning with a mixture of defiance and regret. "I don't have a choice anymore." His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his decision pressing down on him with every passing second. There was no turning back. He had already given up the one thing that had kept him going for so long, control. The officer didn't say anything at first. He simply watched James, his expression unreadable. The silence between them stretched on, thick with tension, as if they were both waiting for something to happen, waiting for some final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. James felt his breath catch in his throat, his thoughts a chaotic blur of doubt and fear. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore," James whispered, barely audible. The words were raw, fragile. They carried a weight that he hadn't been willing to admit to himself until now. Trust had always been something he had given up on a long time ago. His past had taught him that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. People left. People betrayed you. And in the end, you were the only one left to pick up the pieces. The officer stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Trust is hard, I know. But it's the only way forward." He paused, letting the words settle. "If you're willing to take that first step, you won't have to do it alone. You have more control than you think." James stood still, the officer's words hanging in the air like a fragile thread connecting them. Could he really trust this man? Could he really trust anyone again? It felt like a lie, like a dream he had long since abandoned. But for the first time, a part of him wondered if it might be true. Maybe this officer wasn't just trying to use him. Maybe, just maybe, he could offer him something that James had been searching for: hope. "I'm ready," James said, his voice stronger now, though the fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what was to come, but he was willing to try. He had no other choice. The officer nodded, his expression softening. "It's not going to be easy, but you're not alone in this. We'll make sure of that." James nodded back, the weight in his chest a little lighter now. He wasn't sure what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely lost. Maybe, just maybe, he could still find his way back. And for that, he was willing to take the first step. James sat motionless on the edge of the bed, the faint light of dawn creeping through the cracks in the blinds, casting a pale glow across the room. His mind was a tangled mess of conflicting emotions, each one gnawing at him, pulling him in different directions. His heart was heavy with the weight of what he had just done. He had handed over the box. It was done. But was it really? Was he free from the consequences, or had he simply exchanged one chain for another? He dragged a hand through his messy hair, feeling the rough stubble on his chin, the faint remnants of last night's exhaustion. Sleep had eluded him, his mind too restless, too filled with questions. He had told himself, over and over, that what he did was necessary. It was for the greater good, wasn't it? Yet, the more he thought about it, the more the doubt crept in like an insidious shadow, suffocating his resolve. The weight of the decision hung like a leaden cloud in his chest. He thought about the officer's words earlier, "We'll make sure of that," and tried to reassure himself that everything would be fine. But even as he clung to that fragile hope, the fear began to take root. The officer had seemed confident, but what if they had lied to him? What if there were more layers to the web he had just walked into? He had always known this day would come, the day when he would have to face the consequences of his choices, but it hadn't prepared him for how it would feel, how the reality of it would sink in. James stood up, pacing the small room, unable to shake the feeling of being trapped. The walls seemed to close in around him, each step echoing in the silence. His hands were shaking slightly, betraying the calm demeanor he was desperately trying to project. He didn't want to admit it, but the truth was undeniable: he was terrified. Terrified of what he had unleashed, terrified of what would come next. The world he had once controlled with ease now felt alien to him, a place he no longer understood. He moved toward the window, his eyes scanning the city below, though his thoughts remained far from the view outside. The busy streets, the people rushing to and fro, all seemed distant. Detached. His life was no longer anchored in the world he once knew. It was as if he had stepped into some new, darker version of his existence, one where the rules no longer applied, and every move he made was a gamble. He had sacrificed so much for this, and for what? To feel like a puppet, dancing on strings pulled by forces far beyond his control? His reflection in the window stared back at him, someone he barely recognized anymore. He wasn't the man he had been before. He had shed that skin the moment he walked into the warehouse and made the choice that had changed everything. The decision had shattered something deep inside him, something he hadn't realized was still there. His sense of self. His belief that he could control his fate. Just as he thought he might suffocate under the weight of it all, there was a knock at the door. It was sharp, sudden, pulling him from his thoughts. His heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? The officer? Had they come for him already? Was this the moment everything collapsed? James froze, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't expected anyone. He didn't want anyone. Not now. He wasn't ready to face the world outside, let alone someone who might demand answers he couldn't give. Slowly, he moved toward the door, his steps hesitant, as if each one took him further into unknown territory. When he opened the door, he was met with an unexpected sight: Rachel. Her figure stood there, illuminated by the soft light of the hallway, her eyes heavy with a mixture of concern and determination. She looked different somehow, more resolute than he had seen her in a while. It was as if she had come here with a purpose, like she had made up her mind about something, and now she was here to make him face it. "James," she said, her voice low but steady, "we need to talk." He couldn't hide the shock on his face. The words were simple, but they carried weight. His mind raced. How much did she know? Had she figured it out? Could she sense the change in him, the cracks that had started to form? His thoughts tangled, spinning in a blur. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He wasn't ready for this conversation. He wasn't ready to face anyone, least of all Rachel. He stepped aside, allowing her into the apartment, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. As she entered, her eyes briefly scanned the room, taking in the mess, the cluttered desk, the empty coffee cups, the half-drawn blinds. Everything about the room felt like a reflection of his internal chaos. Rachel didn't waste any time. She was never one for small talk, and James respected that about her, even if it made him uneasy now. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him feel like she was seeing straight through him. "I know what you did," she said quietly, but there was no accusation in her voice, just an unshakable certainty. "And I know it wasn't easy for you." Her words hit him like a wave, but he didn't flinch. His heart raced, his palms suddenly clammy. She knew. How much did she know? Was this the moment everything unraveled? I had no choice," James began, his voice cracking slightly. The words came out in a rush, and he immediately regretted them. He sounded like he was trying to convince himself, not her. "I thought it would fix things. I thought I could end it, but I don't know anymore. I don't know what's real, Rachel." She took a step closer, her presence grounding him in a way that nothing else had in days. The air between them seemed to shift, the distance shrinking as she closed the gap. Her hand gently reached out, placing itself on his shoulder, a steady anchor in the storm of his emotions. "You're not alone in this," Rachel said, her voice soft but firm. "You've never been alone, even if you felt like it. You don't have to carry this by yourself, James. It's not too late to fix this." James closed his eyes for a moment, the words sinking in. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that there was a way out, but doubt was still gnawing at him. "I don't know if I can. I don't know if I'm even capable of fixing what I've done." You can, she replied, her hand tightening briefly on his shoulder. It's not about being perfect, James. It's about being willing to try. To take the first step, even if it's messy. Even if it hurts. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. There was a rawness in her expression, a depth of emotion that made his chest tighten. She wasn't just telling him what he needed to hear. She was offering him something real, something tangible. A chance. A way out of the prison he had built for himself. I'm scared, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper, the truth spilling out before he could stop it. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if I can handle it. Rachel gave him a small, reassuring smile. None of us know what comes next. But that doesn't mean we stop moving forward. James let out a slow breath, feeling the tightness in his chest loosen just a little. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe he didn't have to face this alone. Maybe, just maybe, he could find his way out of the mess he had made. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe it. I'm ready, he said quietly, his voice steadying as he spoke. I don't know how it will turn out, but I'm ready to face it. I'm ready to make things right. Rachel nodded, her hand still resting on his shoulder. That's all anyone can ask for. One step at a time, James. He nodded back, his heart a little lighter, his resolve a little firmer. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might be able to walk it. The courtroom had expected a confession of guilt. What they got instead was a revelation. Behind James Walker's quiet demeanor was a past marked by loss, duty, and a haunting promise he had never broken. He hadn't broken in to steal, he had returned to remember, to honor, and to protect something far more sacred than any law could define.